In which case you really have to be very, very circumspect, you know. Because they're going to look for every little opening that you give them, so you've got to be very guarded in your words.
I was doing a metta this morning in the guided meditation, and I was start with people close to people in your family, and I ended with people you don't like very much, and I was like, well, I have to figure out where they belong.
Okay, well I meant when I said close to you, people that you really like and really love, okay?
People that are easier to get.
Easier to get started with, yeah. Passage 214 is interesting, and it talks about the connection between conceit and grief. Just to put the story quickly, Thanissaro Bhikkhu is talking about how he was contemplating at one point, and the question arose in his mind, he said, anything in the world has changed would cause me any sorrow. And he says, I couldn't think of anything. And Ananda's there saying, well, wait a minute, what if anything happens to the Buddha? Wouldn't that cause you sorrow? And then Thanissaro Bhikkhu says, even if there were a change and alteration in the teacher, my friend, there would arise in within me no sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, or despair. Still I would have this thought, what a great being of great might, of great prowess, has disappeared. If the Blessed One were to remain for a long time, that would be for the benefit of many people, for the happiness of many people out of sympathy for the world, for the welfare, benefit, and happiness of human and divine beings. And surely, said Venerable Nun, it's because Thanissaro Bhikkhu's eye-making and mind-making and latent tendencies to conceit have been well uprooted, that even if there were change and alteration in the teacher, there would arise in him no sorrow. So the grief comes from your conceit, the I and the my that you create around somebody. This is my husband, this is my wife, this is my partner, these are my children. And then when they go or something happens to them, there's a huge gap in the I there, and that's why you're grieving. So keep that in mind. And when something happens like that, you realize, okay, the grief here that I'm feeling is over my loss. And I've got to work on my sense of possession there if I'm going to be able to get past the grief. Years back when I was talking with Larry Rosenberg, he'd been trained in a Korean Zen monastery, and then he'd come back and then switched over to Theravada. Spent some time with Ajahn Suwat, and then the question came one time, when he'd been in Korea, there was a nun who had died. Now in Korean monasteries, it's kind of like schools, the people who come in at the same time tend to regard one another as members kind of the same class. And so the monks and the nuns who came together one particular year, they kind of have a special kind of sense of brotherhood and sisterhood. And the monk who had entered the monastery the same year as that nun broke down and just sort of sobbing horribly during her funeral. And Larry asked, is this a sign of lack of awakening or what's going on here? So he asked Ajahn Suwat, and Ajahn Suwat said, yeah, basically, the monk still had some work to do. And then he told the story on his own that when he first went to stay with Ajahn Fun, who was a student of Ajahn Mun, the thought had occurred to me, if my teacher ever dies, what am I going to do? I'm so dependent on him. But by the time Ajahn Fun actually passed away, Ajahn Suwat's practice had gotten to the point where he didn't feel any personal grief. And Larry's reaction was interesting. He actually said, I'd rather go with a Korean monk. That seems more real, it seems more honest, it seems less repressed or whatever. And I think Ajahn Suwat was being honest, that he wasn't repressing any grief. Because the grief was there, it was over the sense of I and mine. And once you can erase that, then the grief doesn't come. You don't take these things personally. So this is another good reason to learn how to overcome these fetters. You suffer a lot less. Questions on that? Yes, Mark?
I just wanted to ask, is it dangerous to think that we become our own teachers? Or, because that's what's happening in the process, right?
Well, you have to become your own teacher, yeah. And you can start trusting yourself after screen entry. But in the meantime, it's kind of trial and error. Yes.
Ajahn, that list, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, is that the Buddha sort of saying, is he covering specific kinds of suffering with those specific...
He's trying to cover everything, basically. A lot of these lists are meant to say, okay, I'm not going to define it to one particular kind of, I'm trying to cover the whole the whole range. You also have to remember he was living in a time when languages were not standardized. You know, we don't realize what a world would be like without a standardized language. We take them for granted. In English, you know, there's correct English and there's incorrect English. French is defined, and German is defined, and all these other languages are defined. They didn't have that in those days. So when he was talking to people, he had to throw out a lot of words to make sure he got everybody. This is why we have those long strings of adjectives and things. Okay, let's move on to contentment. Passage 5.3. Customs of the noble ones. There's the case where you're content with any old rolled cloth at all. You speak in praise of being content with any rolled cloth. Because in your case it would be clothing. You do not, for the sake of clothing, do anything unseemly or inappropriate. Not getting clothing, you're not agitated getting clothing. You use it unattached to it, uninfatuated, guiltless, seeing the drawbacks of attachment to it and discerning the escape from them. You do not, on account of your content with any old rolled cloth, exalt yourself or disparage others. In this you are diligent, deft, and alert, and mindful. This is said to be among standing firm in the ancient traditions of the noble ones. Okay, contentment here basically means being content with what you got. And at the same time, it means learning how not to exalt yourself. I'm better than other people because I can do without. So you see the value, you see the dangers both in the attachment to the material object and also the dangers in the attachment of the conceit that might come around your contentment. So again, this is one of those teachings that you have to look at things from all sides. The same teaching applies to food and shelter. Another passage on the topic of contentment. But before we go on to that, there is a passage I should have included here. I don't know why I didn't. Where the Buddha says it was because of being not content with skillful attainments that he attained awakening. In other words, the fact that he'd gotten so far, he said, okay, this isn't good enough, there's got to be something more. He kept pushing. So when you're talking about contentment, remember it has to be focused specifically on the issue of contentment with your physical surroundings. And then as for contentment with, I've got X number of defilements, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't work.
So, generally, when one becomes aware of the conceit, whether it's better than, worse than, what's the karate chop?
Well, the karate chop is, there are a lot of people out there who are poor who have less than I am. If it's a matter of contentment. One good way of testing your conceit, there's a great story in the Visuddhimagga, where there was this monk who was practicing the sitter's practice. In other words, sitting up all night, never didn't lie down at all. And he wanted to do it in such a way that nobody knew. And he actually was living in a hut with another monk. And of course, back in those days, they didn't have lights or anything, so you could sit in the dark and the other person wouldn't know. But one night there happened to be a thunderstorm came up, and there was a lightning bolt and everything, and the friend saw the silhouette of this monk sitting there against the window. He said, "Oh, are you practicing the sitter's practice?" And the monk lay down and said, "No." And then he started it up again the next night. So if you find yourself feeling conceited about something like that, now if you find you're feeling conceited about observing the precepts, don't break the precepts. But just remind yourself, I'm not doing this to be better than other people. For me, the karate chop is you're like being in the hospital. You're taking your medicine, other people are not taking their medicine. Does that make you any better than them? No. You're not here to be a better patient than them. You're here to get rid of your illness. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a sense of self-esteem that comes around the practice, but just you should be comparing yourself to the people around you. If you're going to make comparisons, compare yourself to what you were last year or last month. sometime in the past. So you're not competing. There's this really nice story in passage 5.6 about Padilla, who used to be a king. He goes sitting at the foot of a tree, explaining, repeating, exclaiming, "What bliss, what bliss." The monks are concerned. They report this to the Buddha, because they're afraid that he's recalling all the happiness he had when he was a householder. So the Buddha calls him in. And I think the Buddha knows what's going on. He just wants to have a chance for Padilla to declare his reasoning in front of everybody. He says, what do you have in mind? This is toward the end of the passage. What meaning do you have in mind that you repeatedly exclaim, "What bliss, what bliss?" He says, before, when I was a householder maintaining the bliss of kingship, I had guards posted within and without the royal apartments, within and without the city, within and without the countryside. But even though I was thus guarded, thus protected, I dwelled in fear, agitated, distrustful, and afraid. But now I'm going alone to a forest, to the foot of a tree, to an empty dwelling. I dwell without fear, unagitated, confident, unafraid, unconcerned, unruffled, my wants satisfied, with my mind like a wild deer. This is the meaning I have in mind that I repeatedly exclaim, "What bliss, what bliss." It's good to keep this in mind, because most of us are exposed to I don't know how many images a day about the bliss of possession, the bliss of acquisition. And it's good to remember that there are ways of finding happiness that involve letting go. In my own case, I remember my experience of the first time I actually saw a monk on alms road. I'd seen documentaries about monks going on alms, and when you see a documentary, you always wonder, is this really happening, or did they set it up? And then I was in Bangkok. First morning in Bangkok, I get up and look out the hotel window, and there's a monk going down the street, stopping off at this store. A woman in the store goes in, gets some food, puts it in his bowl, and turns around and goes. So it's almost like some sort of surreptitious, clandestine activity. But it really struck me, here's someone who represents something totally different. That there is a happiness, and it's kind of infiltrating the society and coming out every day. That there are other values in the world. And it's important to keep that in mind. Because you may be happy without having a lot of stuff. In fact, the less stuff you have, the more less protection you need. I have a student who's quite wealthy, and the security in this person's house is incredible. It's like, when I visit them, it's like you're in a cage. So moving on to seclusion. Passage 6.3. The Buddha's not saying that you shouldn't be around other people, it's just you have to, control what kind of conversation. At that time, a large number of monks, after the meal and returning from their alms run, had gathered at the meeting hall and were engaged in many kinds of bestial topics of conversation. This gives you an idea of what the Buddha thinks of this. Conversation about kings, robbers, and ministers of state, armies, alarms, Ebola, and battles. Food and drink in the best restaurants in Portland. Clothing, furniture, garlands, and scents, relatives, vehicles, villages, towns, cities. Boy, that's sure the towns. The countryside, women and heroes, the gossip of the street and the well, talks of the dead, tales of diversity, in other words, different ways the world might have come about, the creation of the world and the sea, talk of whether things exist or not. Sounds like the walrus and the carpenter. And so the Buddha comes and hears them. And asks them, "What are you talking about?" And they tell him. He says, "It's not right that you do this." And he says, "Here are the 10 topics of proper conversation, which talk on having few wants, on contentment, on seclusion, on non-entanglement, on arousing persistence, on virtue, on concentration, on discernment, on release, and on the knowledge and vision of release." But these are things that are good to talk about when you get together with groups of people. So it's not that you don't hang around people. In fact, that you see the Sangha, the monastic Sangha is designed so that monks have time together, at least for part of the year, every year. The old pattern was that you'd stay put for 3 months and then you'd wander for the rest of the year. You need that time together in order to maintain your sanity. And also for the members of the group to kind of check up on each other and see how things are going. Because it really is important to have that kind of support. And when the monks start living on their own, they get more and more and more into their own ideas and into their own attitudes. And there's not really any check. So you do need some company, you do need some companionship. But you want to look for good companionship. Companionship that's actually helpful in the path. But the Buddha goes on to define seclusion in another level as well. This is in passage 6.7. There's a monk named the Elder who lives alone and extols the virtues of living alone. And so the Buddha asks him, how do you live alone? And he says, Lord, alone I enter the village for alms, alone I return, alone I sit withdrawing meditation, alone I do walking meditation. That's how I live alone, extol the virtues of living alone. The Buddha says, okay, there is that kind of living alone, but there's an even better one. So how is living alone perfected in its details? There's the case where whatever is past is abandoned, whatever is future is relinquished, and any passion and desire with regard to states of being attained in the present is well subdued. In other words, your companions in your mind are your thoughts of the past and the future. You've got to keep those under control. And get yourself secluded from them. That's called mental seclusion. This is borne out in passage 6.8. It talks about how craving as your companion, the man wanders on a long, long time. So you learn how to be free from craving. And that way you can be truly alone. In persistence, the first four passages are important for understanding that when you're talking about persistence or energy or effort, it's not just brute effort, sitting for hours or walking for hours. It means basically learning, one, what is the appropriate thing that needs to be done right now? Because in the first passage, the Buddha talks about what is the faculty of persistence. And this is passage 7.1. There's the case where you keep your persistence aroused for the abandoning of unskillful mental qualities and taking on skillful mental qualities. You are steadfast, solid in your effort, not shirking your duties with regard to skillful mental qualities. And it goes on. You generate desire, endeavor, arouse persistence, uphold and exert your intent for the sake of the non-arising of evil, unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen, for the sake of the abandoning of evil, unskillful qualities that have arisen, for the sake of the arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen, and for the maintenance, non-confusion, increase, plenitude, development, and combination of skillful qualities that have arisen. This is called the faculty of persistence. There are two things that are important. One is that issue of generating desire. You've got to motivate yourself so that you want to do these things. And there's a lot of wisdom that goes into learning how to psych yourself out. We talked about this last night. There are things you know that you should be doing, but you're not doing them. How do you psych yourself into doing them? You've got some addictions you need to know you should be letting go of, and you don't want to let go. Or part of you wants to let go, but it seems to be impossible. How do you psych yourself into letting go? That's one point, one part, an important part of right effort. Just learning how to psych yourself to do the right thing. And then secondly is realizing there are different things that need to be done. Like preventing unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen. This of the four is probably the one that's most overlooked in practice. In other words, there are times when you should plan ahead. If you're going to go to a family reunion, and good old Uncle George knows all your buttons. What are you going to do so that Uncle George doesn't push your buttons? Sit and think about it for a while. How are you going to deal with Uncle George's habits so that the situation doesn't develop? And that's something worth planning. I mean, we don't usually talk about planning during your meditation, but it's useful to schedule a time at the end of each session if you're going to have an issue like this. What do I have to plan for in the course of the day? You're coming fresh out of the meditation, and you should be clear about what some of the possibilities might be. Your mind is sharper, more ready to deal with these issues. Unskillful qualities that have arisen, you've got to figure out, how do I stop this? A couple of things are important. One of the voice in your mind says, you can stop it for 5 minutes, but then you're going to come back and do it anyhow, so then you just keep on doing it. You ever had that voice? But the voice says, you've already committed yourself to doing this, you might as well go ahead and finish it. Trying to make you feel morally obligated. So you've got to learn how to counteract these voices. And then finally, for the arising of skillful qualities that are not there, and then for the preservation and development of skillful qualities that have arisen. Okay, these are 4 different kinds of things you can do. And you want to learn how to figure out, okay, what's the appropriate thing I need to do right now? Is working on the skillful qualities, or working on abandoning the unskillful ones? Which is the task at hand right now. So there's a certain amount of discernment that goes into that. Passage 7.3 is the famous one about sona and the lute. And the question is if your lute is tight, or the vina here, the strings are too tight, it doesn't sound right. The strings are too loose, it doesn't sound right. You tune them to the right pitch. And then it goes on to say, in the same way, sona over-aroused persistence leads to restlessness, or over-slack persistence leads to laziness. Thus you should determine the right pitch for your persistence, attune the pitch of the 5 faculties to that, and there pick up your theme. Now he's using a musical analogy here. Apparently the vina in those days had 5 strings, and so he's comparing them to the 5 strings, which we talked about last night. There's conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. And whenever you tune a musical instrument, as you know, you tune one string first, you got that string properly tuned, and then you tune the rest of the strings to that. So they're all playing in harmony. So whatever the level of your mindfulness and level of your concentration will depend on how much energy you've got. So you take the amount of energy you've got as your guide, and then attune all the others to that. Now you're coming home from work, and it's not the time to sit down and say, I will not rise from the seat, make my blood dry up and my flesh dry up, until I achieve ultimate true awakening. That's not the time for that. At the end of the day, the time is, I'm going to make it through the hour, okay? And then you adjust your practice to that. And that doesn't mean you make it slack. I mean, there are times when you have the energy, you should actually carry through the energy. So that's one way of deciding how much energy is appropriate. The other way is in passage 7.4. Question is, how is striving fruitful? How is exertion fruitful? There's the case where when not loaded down, you don't load yourself down with pain, nor do you reject pleasure that accords with the Dhamma, although you're not infatuated with that pleasure. In other words, and this goes on to say, you discern that when I exert a bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication against this cause of stress, then from the fabrication of exertion there is dispassion. When I look on with equanimity at that cause of stress, then from the development of equanimity there is dispassion. So you exert a fabrication against the first cause, and you practice equanimity with regard to the second. So in other words, certain problems in the mind require that you really work at them. Other problems require all you have to do is just watch it and it's going to go away. You have to be prepared, given the situation, to apply the appropriate type of effort, the appropriate amount of effort. Talking about exerting a fabrication here. Bodily fabrication is the breath. So the first thing you do is say, okay, how's my breathing around this? Could I breathe in a different way? Saying your sensual desires overtaking you. Where do you direct the breath energy in your body so as to alleviate that sense of, I've got to follow through with this desire? I found that the backs of the hands and the tops of the feet are helpful. It helps to release things. Verbal fabrication is you look at how am I talking to myself about this issue. And the mental fabrication is feelings and perceptions. How am I labeling the issue in my mind? One of the worst labels is the one that, okay, I had this desire 2 weeks ago, and then I had it again last week, and then it started getting more and more frequent. It's building up, it's becoming a big wave, and it's going to crest. Don't believe that. It's just a perception that you start applying things into things, and that starts giving more emphasis, more oomph to the unskillful habit. There was a great picture I saw in a meditation book one time. It was a very detailed drawing of a tiger's face, and the tiger's face was very realistic, and then the body was a piece of paper folded. So a lot of our defilements come along that way. They look really convincing and really scary to begin with. But if you sit with them for just a little bit, then it goes away. So don't believe the perception, oh my gosh, it's going to come on, it's going to eat me up, I might as well go for it. So those are some of the issues that surround the issue of persistence. In other words, what type of persistence how do you talk yourself into doing the right thing? What's the right type and what's the right amount? And the right amount, of course, depends both on how much energy you have right now and also the type of problem that you're facing. Some problems require just a little bit of effort, others require a lot. And it's your discernment that you develop in the practice where you realize which is which. Any questions on those? We've been kind of racing through these last passages. So, yes?
Answer a question back on contentment. I was wondering, some uses of that word in pretty bad rap in the West. It's sort of hollow, defenses, nothing better was available. And I wonder if there are any other translations or any other advice you have thinking about it as you're noticing it or examining it, encouraging it, and going, okay, this is it.
Well, there's a lot of words that we have to reclaim, and contentment is a good one. It's okay, this is enough for my purposes in that area because I want to focus my energies someplace else. So it's not just saying, okay, whatever, I'm fine. It's basically saying, look, if I spend a lot of energy on painting my kitchen cabinets, that's that much less time to meditate.
So it's more of a sort of
it's prioritizing. It's corralling your effort and it's prioritizing. That's a word that's popular, right? Prioritizing. So prioritize your practice. Deprioritize, all this other stuff that's weighing you down. And it's good to have that ability, just to, I can do without. This is something that's really missing in our culture, because I know it's not so much in Thailand anymore. TV hit a while back, and it's pretty much ruined the culture. But when I first went there, people were often very proud of the fact that they could do without. And it was considered part of training a child in order to be able to live in the world. As the child had to learn how to do without things, so that they wouldn't be easy to bribe or easy to take over. Because that's what it is if you're dependent on lots of comforts, it's very easy for people to bribe you. It's very easy for people to get you to do what they want because they're going to give you these little rewards. But if you say, I don't need that, then you can't be bought. Yes?
It's helped me at times to remember what you said about how we're intoxicated with health and we're intoxicated with things. When we have it, it's awfully easy to be intoxicated with it, but we don't, that's where
it's the wise person who realizes, okay, even though I've got it now, I'm not going to have it forever.
Exactly.
And then I have to live with the results of the stupid things I did under the influence of.
Yeah. And it's a little bit easier to shift over to the practice once you realize that you're under the influence.
Right.
Of this.
Yesterday you spoke about about fear and recognizing how our mind gets taken over like a zombie, and it reminded me of something where that happened to me. My mind was getting obsessed by something that I was unhappy about, and then as you continued talking, well, what happened before your talk was, so this happened just a few days ago, and I was recognizing this, and then I suddenly got fearful of what I recognized was whispering in the back of my head of what I could do to retaliate, that I didn't even recognize was there. But long-time, old-time habits were whispering in my ear that I thought had long been gone, and it kind of frightened me. So when you said that, it kind of put it into, I had a delight in recognizing that, oh, that was just recognizing it and sitting it down, which switched my perspective from
I've got to be afraid of this to, thank goodness, the practice can turn one away from that. So now after talking today and with my earlier questions, I'm just wondering, so then I went home thinking, well, I should visit the delight of the, the skill of the Buddhist teachings and having good teachers come in and remind you of this. I should visit that delight. But now I'm thinking, well, once you've done that, recognize putting it down, and then recognize the delight of having put it down, I can let that go too.
Yeah, like
Rather
that,
than
because while you're delighting in it, that this may sneak up on you in another guise.
May sneak up on me and what?
And another guise.
Yeah.
So it's a delicate balance act.
Yeah.
On the one hand, having the sense of, I'm actually getting someplace with the practice, that gives you the oomph to keep going.
Yeah.
But what does it mean to be going someplace with the practice? It means I'm alert to what's happening in the mind, and I can catch these things. And then you remind yourself, gee, there are probably some other things down there that I haven't been catching. Let's look a little bit more carefully.
Yeah, because what it highlighted for me is I actually could see that when I was afraid, I actually couldn't see clearly everything that was going on. And then when I was delighted, I also couldn't see clearly. It was just, I was looking only at the positive, I was looking only at the negative. But I don't want to forget either of the lessons.
You don't want to forget either lessons, and how you do that, you stay right in the middle. Well, I had a friend who was, she went to Japan. She was interested in learning pottery. And so she apprenticed herself to one of these living national treasures they have over there. And she was always getting discouraged about the fact that, every morning when stuff would come out of the kiln, all of his pots were perfect. And hers would come out, sometimes good, but a lot of ruined pots. And she began to think, gee, I'll never get anywhere with this. And then one morning she came in and it turned out his pots had burned. And what was he doing? He was in the kiln trying to figure out what had happened. So in other words, okay, there was a disaster, but he didn't treat it as a disaster. So this is a lesson I've got to learn from this. And so it's this ability to maintain an even keel, even when things are going bad, and even when things are going well. Got to maintain that even keel. So there can be the kind of the rise in the emotion, but you can't go up and down in the emotion.
So that's not taking it personally.
Right.
Right, okay.
So when things go bad, it's not a disaster. And when things go well, it's not, gold stars, you're superstar. My child is a superstar.
So remembering something like this,
Right.
like that was not pleasant, this was very pleasant, neither one was I seeing clearly.
Right.
In that moment I'm seeing clearly.
And the thing is that it's when you learn how to use these
Yeah.
two sides, I think that's when you're in a better position.
Okay.
Because if you're trying to ride with the pleasure,
Right.
or you're getting into the pain, into the fear, you're not seeing clearly.
Right.
But
And that's
the
when you're not
fear,
seeing
the skillful
clearly.
fears realize, okay, there are things going on in my mind that I still haven't figured out. And they can sneak up on me, so I gotta be alert. But I do have these skills, so I'll bring out my skills as I need them.